Let's skip any long drawn out intros and get right into the benchmarks. Here we're seeing the 3090 versus the 7900 XTX at 1440p Ultra in Cyberpunk on the left hand side, and on the right hand side we're seeing the RT Ultra preset, although I've turned off any upscaling features. This is native resolution. And in the rasterized non-ray trace performance, we're seeing the 7900 XTX winning by 30% by the end of the benchmark run, but in ray tracing, we see the 3090 winning by 12%. Now, we are absolutely going to dive into other ray tracing settings, start out with a deep dive here, and then we'll get into a whole bunch of other games. We'll look at Unreal Engine 5, all sorts of stuff. What kind of stats counters are you looking at up there? Well, the 3 frame rate counters you're seeing on each one. The one on the left is the current frame rate, the one in the middle is the average for the duration of the benchmark run, kind of accumulating, and the one on the right is the 1% lows. You can also see a frame time graph, which is how you should judge the smoothness of the gameplay, because when you're capturing at 60 FPS and uploading a 60 FPS video when it's not 60 FPS on actual gameplay, that can cause things to not look as smooth as they would on an actual screen. But anyway, as promised, let's dive into some other ray tracing settings. When we enable ray tracing at the low preset, it's just local shadows. Everything else is just like the normal ultra preset on the game. And here we actually see the 7900 XTX winning by 17%. So it has a lead, just not as large of a lead as it had when there was no ray tracing enabled at all. At the ray tracing medium preset, the game keeps the local shadows, but it also adds in sun shadows. So as we get outside here, and especially as you can see further out into the city, you can see some differences in these shadows cast by sunlight. Also, there's some global, lighting settings to the medium ray trace setting. Like you can see the red on the pavement there as we passed by was a little bit brighter. Things like that. So there are some differences here. And again, this is at the native resolution. And here at the medium settings, we see the 7900 XTX basically tied, although we technically have a 2% lead at the ray tracing medium settings. So we're definitely seeing that the ray tracing workload that you enable makes a big difference. So I thought I'd dive into this. And the ray tracing reflections, I thought I'd isolate those on the left-hand side. And so this is basically the ultra preset 1440p native with ray trace reflections enabled. And on those settings, we see a very close performance, but the 3090 is winning by 8%. On the right-hand side, we're trying maxing out the 1440p ray tracing at the Ultra preset, but with both DLSS or FSR2 set to the quality preset. And in this case, both of them are able to deliver over 60 FPS, but the 3090 is winning by about 13%. So I thought these were some very interesting results. We're seeing a wide variety of differences based on the type of ray tracing features enabled, how demanding it is. And remember, we started off with a baseline of 30% faster than the 3090 at just 1440p Ultra without any of the ray tracing enabled. You can also look at the kind of effects you're getting from the ray tracing. Now here, I thought I'd look at what about at 4K. So if you try to enable 4K ray tracing at the Ultra setting at native resolution, neither GPU can even stay meaningfully above 30 FPS. So we really have to upscale at this point. On the left-hand side, we're seeing DLSS and FSR2 at the quality setting, which renders at 1440p and upscales from there using the respective algorithm. Here we're seeing the 3090 with a 14% lead. And if we go all the way down to the performance setting to try to get close to 60 FPS, which is rendering at a baseline of 1080p and then trying to upscale to a 4K-like image, we're seeing the 3090 now with a 9% lead. However, I don't know how well this will come across in the YouTube video, but I do think that FSR2 is catching up to DLSS in image quality. At the more aggressive settings, like the performance mode, I do think things like the palm tree branches here, things like that, I do think they can look a bit better with DLSS. So I still think there's a little bit of an upscaling edge there. Anyway, before we leave off of the ray tracing, how about we look at 1080p? And on the left, you're seeing Ultra, and on the right, you're seeing RT Ultra. So again, this gives you a chance to see all of the ray tracing effects enabled, on versus off, left versus right. And we're able to see the performance difference with the 7900 XTX winning by 23% here without ray tracing enabled, but losing by 13% with ray tracing set all the way to the ultra settings. Now, both GPUs at RT Ultra are able to deliver around a 60 FPS experience, although the 7900 XTX is dipping below 60 more frequently. But I think this is also just a demonstration of how demanding the ray tracing ultra setting is in a game like Cyberpunk, where even the 3090 last gen's flagship from Nvidia really wasn't even breaking a 70 FPS average. By the way, both of these GPUs are the Founders Edition for Nvidia and the reference model for AMD, so we are kind of doing an apples to apples as best as we can in that regard. Now, let's look at, okay, what if we just turn the ray tracing off and you wanted to play Cyberpunk at 4K? Because I didn't think with ray tracing enabled, the performance we were getting there and the amount of upscaling required really made sense, at least to my standards. So I was thinking, if we go down to the high settings, we can try playing native. The 7900 XTX wins by 32% and delivers over 70 FPS. Whereas the 3090, even at high settings, again, this is not the ultra settings on the left-hand side, the 3090 has trouble staying above 60 FPS without doing something else on top of that. So if you're able to go down to the high settings and use some upscaling, FSR2 or DLSS2 at the quality setting, so again, that's a native 1440p render and then upscaled using the respective algorithm, then you see them both delivering much higher frame rates. Although the 7900 XTX is still winning, this time by 24%. The 3090 averaging in the mid-80s, and the 7900 XTX actually averaging well over 100 FPS at these settings. So definitely able to perform very, very well here. Now, I did want to show what if we did try 4K Ultra and get more of just a head-to-head here where you can see a little more of what's going on. I'm not going to bother showing you the whole benchmark run, but here we see the 7900 XTX averaging almost 70 FPS, and the 3090 averaging only about 50 FPS. So the 7900 XTX is able to just play the game at Ultra with no ray tracing, but at native and be well over 60 FPS, and the 3090 is unable to do that. So there is definitely a difference there to mention. Hey, but Cyberpunk's getting a little older. How about we jump into Unreal Engine 5? Fortnite is currently the only game with a full Unreal Engine 5 release with features like the shadow mapping, Lumen, Nanite. Lumen is a software-based ray tracing technique, but it can be hardware accelerated. So here we're seeing it with hardware RT off, so we're not using the hardware acceleration, which decreases performance but increases the accuracy of the lighting. Here we're at 1440p Epic hardware RT off. The 3090 is set as our baseline here, the 7900 XTX giving us a 29% lead. The 3090 only averaging just slightly above 60 FPS through this area, whereas the 7900 XTX is at about a 79 FPS average. And also notice a big lead in the 1% lows. Now, if you're looking at my stats counters, you might notice that the 3090 is reporting the power draw and the 7900 XTX isn't. I'm not trying to hide anything, it's just my Riva Tuner statistics server wouldn't read that stat when I ran these benchmarks. So keep that in mind. It is a similar power draw card, maybe a little bit higher. The XTX draws 350 to 360 watts under full load. In my testing when I can get that report. Here we're looking at the hardware RT acceleration turned on. So again, that increases the accuracy of the lighting, but does slightly increase the demand. And it looks like it does increase the demand disproportionately on the AMD hardware, as we would expect with ray tracing. But here the 7900 XTX is still winning by 19% compared to the 3090 with the hardware accelerated ray tracing turned on. So if more games end up being like Fortnite, I don't think we're gonna see, I mean, we do see the hardware acceleration being that advantage for Nvidia, but it doesn't look anywhere near as demanding as what we were seeing in cranked ray tracing games like Cyberpunk. Now here we're looking at 1440p high settings with hardware RT off. So I was just showing that You know, if you go down to high instead of epic, both GPUs are able to deliver a much better performance. I think these would be more realistic settings to actually use in an Unreal Engine 5 game if you wanted a higher frame rate. The 7900 XTX winning by 33% now, with 116-ish FPS average, and the 3090 in the upper 80s, around 88 to 90. Now, if we go to the 4K settings, they couldn't max the game out at 4K Epic without some kind of upscaling or turning things off or going well below 60 FPS. At the high settings, with hardware accelerated ray tracing turned off, the 7900 XTX is able to average just a little bit above 60 FPS, whereas the 3090 is averaging a little bit above 50 FPS, giving the XTX a 21% lead. Noticing the lead here is not quite as big as we saw at 1440p, so that'll be something to keep an eye on throughout the rest of the benchmarks. Now, if we turn on the Epic settings with the hardware accelerated ray tracing, in other words, completely max it out, like I said, the performance drops quite a bit, but we could try upscaling. In this, I'm using the TSR upscaling at the quality setting. TSR is similar to FSR and DLSS, but it's one built into the Unreal Engine 5, and at the quality setting, it is upscaling from a 1440p baseline. Here we're seeing the 7900 XTX with an 18% lead, but again, the hardware accelerated ray tracing is turned on here. And the 3090 is still a little below 60, and the 7900 XTX above 60 here. I thought I'd throw in a 1080p test, might as well. What if we tried to completely max things out? Epic settings with the hardware accelerated ray tracing on. We're seeing the 7900 XTX winning by 23%. The 3090 averaging in the mid-70s, and the 7900 XTX in the lower 90 FPS range. Also, just again, I want to stress that we're not trying to show settings that you would play Fortnite at. We're using Fortnite because it's an Unreal Engine 5 game with features like Lumen and Nanite that a lot of future AAA games are going to be using. So before we wrap up the Unreal Engine 5 testing, I thought we might as well also look at 1080p Epic without the hardware accelerated ray tracing, see what the performance difference looks like there. We see the 7900 XTX now at a 32% lead. So it's interesting, we're definitely seeing the 7900 XTX in the lighter ray tracing workloads, like what we're seeing in the Unreal Engine 5 Lumen, performing a lot more like what we saw with just something light like ray tracing shadows in Cyberpunk, something like that. And overall, the lighting in Fortnite looks excellent. The performance demands are pretty high, but speaking of excellent lighting, how about a Plague Tale Requiem? Here we see the 1440p Ultra settings, and we see the 7900 XTX winning by 37% in this game, so bigger than what we were seeing in Cyberpunk. Both GPUs giving a good performance at these settings, so I don't think we need to turn it down or upscale. Plague Tale Requiem is another kind of next-gen console-only title with no PS4 or Xbox One support, just PS5 and Series X. So it's another game pushing the boundaries, although it uses an in-house engine, no Unreal Engine here, and honestly, it's one of the best-looking games I've ever seen. Now, they have updated this game to have some ray tracing effects, but that update happened after I ran these benchmarks, and it's also just ray traced shadows, which I'm going to be honest, guys, I'm not blown away by ray traced shadows. Usually I feel like the performance hit isn't particularly worth it, but that's just my opinion. Now, here at the 4K Ultra settings, we're seeing the 3090 dipping below 60 FPS, and even the 7900 XTX when you get into the more demanding scenes, because this cutscene is not as demanding as some other areas of the game. Even the 7900 XTX will dip to around 50 FPS in this game. We're holding right around 60, a little bit below in this scene, but as you run down the hill and things like that, it does dip a bit more. But we're still seeing a 31% lead for AMD here. And this was, I will mention, one of the Nvidia-sponsored titles, but we are seeing actually a stronger lead here than we saw in either Cyberpunk or Fortnite in a lot of these settings. Now, the Callisto protocol is an interesting test because it's one of the best-looking Unreal Engine 4 games, and this is an AMD-sponsored title, so I want to at least throw in a little bit of that either way. At 1440p Ultra settings, no ray tracing enabled here, no upscaling, we're seeing the 7900 XTX leading by 14%. Now that's interesting because, again, AMD-sponsored title, we actually see one of the lower leads that we've seen without ray tracing enabled throughout the testing. Now, that's not completely unheard of in Unreal Engine 4, though, where a lot of times we've seen NVIDIA, like just kind of the engine itself, seems to have NVIDIA outperform compared to the average of what you'll see in some other games. Now, they both did well at 1440p Ultra without ray tracing enabled, and even at 4K Ultra, both GPUs holding a little below 60 FPS through this really difficult corridor, but this is kind of the torture test of the benchmark. A lot of the game runs a lot better than that. Here we're seeing the 7900 XTX with a 15% lead. The overall averages are above 60 FPS. And this game does feature upscaling if you wanted to use it. It does have FSR 2. No DLSS in this title, but again, NVIDIA GPUs can use FSR upscaling if they need it. Now, I'm not going to test out the ray tracing in this game, mainly because it becomes very CPU and memory limited very easily, so it's not going to really show the GPU difference very well. But how about Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2? No, that is not a typo, and no, I did not mess up any of the settings. At the 1440p balanced settings here, which, by the way, I went with balanced settings rather than the extreme settings because as a competitive multiplayer game, I think that balanced settings are a much more realistic representation of what many people will do. They want to turn down settings to get as high of a frame rate as possible. And speaking of that, we are seeing an 88% lead for the 7900 XTX here, averaging nearly 300 FPS versus closer to 150, a little over 150 FPS for the 3090. It is a massive difference. And this, like I said, is not a mistake. This is kind of expected behavior in this game. AMD GPUs just outperform their NVIDIA counterparts in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and by extension also in Warzone 2. Although, especially in the Battle Royale, you're more likely to become CPU limited at times. Although when you are CPU limited, AMD GPUs are able to reach higher frame rates when CPU limited due to lower overhead on how their graphics operates on the CPU. But anyway, here we're seeing a 69 nice percent lead for the 7900 XTX, and this is the 4K Extreme preset. So whereas on the 1440p balance settings, I was trying to show what I thought was a more realistic use case. In this setting, we're just looking at if you crank the engine all the way to the extreme settings and run it at 4K resolution, anything majorly different. Well, again, 69% lead instead of 88% lead for the 7900 XTX, but still overperforming compared to our typical result in other games, but like I said, expected in this game in particular. So AMD seems to be a very good way to go if you're interested in Call of Duty. Now, let's test out some other games. So this is Horizon Zero Dawn, and we're seeing honestly not as big of a performance lead as we've seen in some other games. This is closer to what we saw in Unreal Engine 4 with Callisto Protocol, just about a 14% lead. And it's actually interesting, the 3090 is averaging almost 100 FPS throughout the benchmark run, and the 7900 XTX about again, 14% higher than that, so it's almost easy to scale the percentages just in your head there. But anyway, so I guess it's just interesting to see a variety of games, which is what we're going to look at next, is see how we perform in different situations, because we've seen wide swings here. Here we're seeing just a 14% lead. In other situations we saw, almost doubling the performance in Call of Duty. What if we went to a DX11 game like God of War at the 4K Ultra settings? Well, here we're seeing a 21% lead for the 7900 XTX, which is better than what we saw in a couple of situations, but worse than what we saw in others. I'm not sure if that's due to this being DX11, but I did want to throw in a relatively modern DX11 game just to see how that performed, because most of the other stuff we've seen here was DX12. Both GPUs performing very well in this game. I think you'd be very happy with either of them. But again, the lead is a little smaller here than we saw in some other situations. The overall performance would be more similar to this scene here rather than during the cutscenes, so around 80 FPS on the 3090 and mid-90s on the 7900 XTX. That's more typical during actual gameplay, and of course there are more demanding things, but I'm using the intro cutscene to get it perfectly matched here. Now, Forza Horizon 5 at the 4K Extreme settings is showing a 25% lead for the 7900 XTX. So again, we're seeing quite a variety of results in comparison here. Now, this game with the 6000 series for AMD used to be a pretty big advantage when it supported smart access memory, but Nvidia didn't support resizable bar. But since then, Nvidia has, I think, whitelisted this game for resizable bar support, so they've pulled a lot closer together. Also, this game has added ray tracing during the driving segments, but I don't believe that's actually enabled at the 4K Extreme preset. You have to manually change the ray tracing settings if you want that to show up there, and I'll show you the actual benchmark run. I think I mentioned already in the benchmarks, but in case you missed it, the models we were testing here was the reference model, 7900 XTX from AMD, and then it was the Founders Edition model of the RTX 3090 right here from Nvidia, and they were run at their out-of-the-box settings. The full test system specs will be below in the video description, and also I did want to show the cards, and then also just mention, every now and then I get comments on videos like this with the side-by-side benchmarks, especially when I show Fortnite. They're like, this has to be fake because you can't capture the gameplay of a multiplayer game perfectly side-by-side like that. That's true, you can't capture it when you're playing it live, but Fortnite has a replay feature where you can replay a game you've already played in-engine and change the graphics settings and resolution and all of that and use the gameplay camera, and that's what I'm doing here to be able to capture that. Most of the other games have a built-in benchmark that I'm recording, or I'm using an in-game cutscene and stuff like Plague Tale Requiem or God of War, where you can then sync up the footage through the cutscene, that kind of thing. Anyway, so that's how I'm capturing all of this and then showing you those stats. And again, I mentioned it in the video, but if you missed it, the 7900 XTX wasn't reporting its power consumption to my Riva Tuner statistics server through MSI Afterburner. So I wasn't trying to hide the power, it just wasn't available to show. However, it does draw similar power to the 3090. When I've tested it, it runs 350 to 360 watts or so at full load, and similar to what the 3090 is doing. So similar power consumption. Now, overall thoughts, like what do I have behind me right now? I mean, this video wasn't necessarily about pricing because I'm not 100% sure that these two GPUs would be the two you'd be thinking about. I mean, maybe you'd be thinking about upgrading from your 3090 and like, should I go with the 7900 XTX or should I go Nvidia? Again, that kind of a question. But as far as buying these two directly, well, I mean, let's look at what the pricing is actually at right now. I mean, the 7900 XTX is supposed to have a $1,000 MSRP. In reality, they usually cost closer to $1,100, which is what we're seeing here, although depending on how supply shipments are coming in and things like that, and if you're watching this video in the future, that pricing could change. The 3090, if you try to buy it new right now, is a pretty terrible deal, around $1,400. It's not as good as a 4080, even if you're going NVIDIA route, and 4080s cost less, so I don't see the point in buying one of these new. If you look at the used market, at eBay, I'm seeing 3090s used going in the $800 to $1,000 range, it looks like. I'm just sorting for buy it now pricing right now and seeing what's kind of available. Hey, $29,000. Oh, you get 10 of them. It's a lot of 10. Those weren't mined on or anything, I'm sure. So anyway, and then the 7900 XTX, if we did compare used, I'm not really seeing a lot used at this point. It's a very new graphics card. So there's a few that are just a little under $1,000. But it is looking like, the pricing's kind of all over the place. So this isn't really a direct pricing comparison video. So what was the point? Well, I was really interested in seeing how AMD's current generation flagship performed against the previous generation, especially in ray tracing. That's why I started out with those benchmarks. And I thought it was really interesting to see it going from, it could be as much as 15 or more % faster, even with ray tracing enabled, or it could be as much as almost 15% slower with ray tracing completely maxed out. And that's why I wanted to go through all of those different ray tracing settings, right? With Cyberpunk, low, medium, ultra, reflections, all of that. And I thought that was a very interesting comparison. In the newer game like Unreal Engine 5 Fortnite with the hardware accelerated Lumen, we saw that it was more akin to the lower ray tracing settings in something like Cyberpunk, where the 7900 XTX is performing faster than the RTX 3090 with that ray tracing enabled. So overall, I would say that the 7900 XTX, in other words, AMD's current generation flagship has caught up to the performance of Nvidia's previous generation flagship and possibly surpassed it depending on the settings, but also falling behind depending on the settings. So maybe we'll average it out and call it about the same, but keep in mind the higher the ray tracing workload, the larger the advantage the Nvidia GPU might still have. So that was interesting. Now, in overall rasterized performance, it was all over the place. We'd see the 7900 XTX as much as almost doubling the performance in something like Call of Duty, but that was clearly an outlier. In other games, I think our highest results were in the upper 30% range. We saw some results as low as 15% or so faster. I'd say the more typical results seem to be around 30%, maybe a little bit more. If I compare to other reviewers, like if we go to the relative performance chart from Tech Power Up, they're showing the 7900 XTX is 33% faster at rasterized 4K performance than the 3090. Again, pretty representative of my results here. But what I like to do with these tests is dig in and see how that varies game by game and graphics setting by setting and all of that. Overall thoughts, I think, is that the 7900 XTX is certainly an interesting card. But like I said, this wasn't necessarily a buying guide between the two. I really wanted to dive into especially how things like the ray tracing had changed over time. So I'm not going to do a real extended final thoughts section here. Really, I'm actually more interested in what you guys think and also what other graphics cards you might be interested in seeing these head-to-head comparisons on. I will mention that these recordings and all this footage is fairly recent, but it is not on the absolute latest update. I took all of this testing from other benchmarks that I ran for other reviews a month or so ago. So it's fairly recent, but not completely brand new. But they were tested at the same time in the same game builds. I'll be looking to do an updated suite of benchmarks, especially on the more mid-range cards as the new ones come out, and get a whole suite of that going on, and with even newer games coming out and everything like that. I hope all of you have an excellent day.